Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to the afternoon session, the late afternoon session for day 2 of NENA's New Economy in Progress workshop and conference. This session today, I'm really looking forward to it. We're going to be talking about fascinating issues around work, universal basic income, and how the new economy looks in these particular areas. First of all, I'd like to give an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play in Brisbane, and I'm in North Brisbane, which is actually the traditional lands of the Turrbal people. But in Brisbane, we always acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples because they lived and worked across these areas since time immemorial. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and future, the phenomenal legacy of caring for country that has left this continent in such an amazing state, particularly pre-colonisation. And as I always like to say, inside the new economy work, I also acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonisation and the task ahead for all of us in playing a role in decolonising the work that we do and exploring new ways forward that build and support our work with decolonising and show solidarity for the First Nations peoples of this continent. Because time is a little short, we have a wonderful panel for you and everyone's limited to 12 minutes. We've all agreed that that acknowledgement of country will be our acknowledgement for this session. But at this moment, I do invite you all to spend just a few seconds thinking about where you live, the land that you enjoy either playing on or visiting for holidays in Australia. And let's just all be appreciative of always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So now what I'd like to do is introduce our speakers. You would have read the program, but Tim, Jane, Loriana, James and John have all got unique and wonderful perspectives to share with us around the world of work and universal basic income and many related topics. All our speakers have 12 minutes each, and then we'll be able to allow a good half an hour for questions and discussion. If you would like to ask any questions as we go, because the question session's at the end, please do write your questions into the chat. I'll be taking them and saving them up. Otherwise, write them down, and when we have our open discussion, you're very welcome to raise a hand and ask them yourselves. So I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, Tim Hollow. Tim, would you like to kick off our session? Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Michelle, and really pleased to be here. Thanks to NENA for having me again. I want to start also very briefly by acknowledging that we're meeting on stolen land and acknowledge that I'm joining from the land of the Ngunnawal people in beautiful Canberra. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present and still to come. Their custodianship over this land over countless millennia stands as an extraordinary example. They've never ceded the land because in their worldview, a worldview that is so relevant to what we're talking about, they cannot cede the land. Country owns us, not the other way around. This is Indigenous wisdom, it's ecological wisdom, but it's also common to so much radical Western politics that we forget about a lot of the time. It's common to the true levellers and diggers of the English Revolution in the 1640s and 50s, to the Paris Communards, to Murray Bookchin's municipal confederalism, and so much more. Staking a claim to the ownership of land, building walls around it, seeking to control all within those walls, and increasingly enclose more and more. That's the core of our destructive culture. It's the culture of capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and extractivism. It's what I call anti-ecological culture, and I want to take a little time to start this section of 3 kind of interwoven presentations by Jane, Loriana and myself before the other 2 speakers, with a discussion of what that might mean, leading into an analysis of extractive labour and how a UBI can help reverse that. The words ecology and economy come, of course, from the same root, the ancient Greek word oikos, meaning home, household or dwelling place. Ecology combines it with the suffix logos to become the meaning or understanding of home, while economy adds the suffix nomos, becoming household rules or management. I reckon that the difference in practice between understanding our dwelling place and managing it is found in where and how we build the walls of the home. For the complex adaptive systems of ecologies, all boundaries are porous. All individuals are systems and all systems are individual parts of larger systems. The greater the diversity and interconnection, the better. In ecological thinking, the walls become the world all around, in Maurice Sendak's immortal phrase, from where the wild things are. There are walls. Walls are necessary. Elinor Ostrom reminds us that through the importance of setting agreed boundaries in commons management. But like the walls of the cells in our bodies, they need to breathe. They need to be permeable, and they must be movable as circumstances change. Thinking ecologically, our dwelling place is the whole world, or our part of the whole world, interdependent with everybody else's parts. As anti-ecological culture develops, the walls of the home transform from being the world all around into solid structures with which to define the limits of our world. The philosophy of separation and dominance sees humanity construct stone walls to divide us from them, to enable us to conquer and subdue them, to believe we can utterly control what is inside our walls, and to enclose ever more territory and extract value from it. The core destructive aspect of this anti-ecological economic worldview is what I think has most usefully and evocatively been described by Naomi Klein and others as extractivism. Extractivism upends and erases the indigenous institutionalization of stewardship through which human societies suppressed for millennia the extractivist impulse, which has always and will always exist. Once we start enclosing land and people inside stone walls, we replace the principle that country owns us with the belief that all things in the world are subject to our ownership. That the soil under our feet, the water we drink, the air we breathe, the animals and plants we share the land with, are resources to be bought, sold, and stolen, and from which to extract value. The agricultural economist Esther Boserup argues that the best way to keep people subservient is to deprive them of the right to be independent cultivators. And that points to what has become, in some ways, the linchpin of extractivism, turning us, our bodies, our minds, our emotions, our time, into a resource from which to extract value. Extractivist industrial capitalist economies need a supply of cheap and obedient labour. Governments ensure this by undermining the ability of workers to collectively bargain through unions, and crucially, by making the ability of workers to collectively bargain, by making being unemployed intolerable. In Australia, as elsewhere around the world, we've seen a series of punitive policies introduced to make those who cannot find work suffer. From work for the dole and internship programs that leave people less employable and reduce the amount of available paid labour, to compulsory parenting classes that make parenting responsibilities harder to meet. From pointless bureaucracy to needlessly humiliating drug testing, not to speak of the horrific robo-debt program, it's obvious that the system is deliberately coercive. It's a dominance-driven policy approach, which is designed not just to punish the currently unemployed, but to use those people's suffering as a warning to others. You do not want to quit your job, no matter how demeaning it is, no matter how badly your boss treats you. It's a direct parallel to the use of torture on Manus Island and Nauru to warn refugees not to come here. And similarly, the only way this is possible is if governments dehumanize the people they are governing. And they do that by reducing the value of human life to what we can sell our labour for. By entangling our ability to sell our labour with the capacity to survive, extractivism is turned on us. What's more, it's become deeply ingrained into our culture that hard work, earning a crust by selling our labour, is the only legitimate and worthwhile way of contributing and participating. This fetishization of paid labour and the co-option of the union movement into the fetishization is among the greatest successes of extractivism, cemented by the Protestant work ethic, directly imposed by bosses in the 18th century, saying that leisure only gave time to the devil to whisper thoughts in your ear. That has become, on the one hand, a cultural obsession with declaring how busy we are, and on the other, an assumption that people won't work, won't contribute or participate unless they're forced to. In reality, people actually work best, contribute best, participate with the most commitment and joy when you give them the space and the opportunity to find their own agency, when you cultivate rather than extract their value. Which brings us to universal basic income. The way I understand UBI is as a policy which treats income the way we currently treat health and education, where our society agrees that every person should have access to basic levels of health care and education. UBI extends that to income so as to create a floor beneath which nobody can fall. It simply seeks to structurally eliminate poverty by setting the base level of income not at zero, but at an agreed level above the poverty line. UBI is transformative of ideas and of structures. It radically shifts the way we see paid labour. It can radically change our relationship with the state and with each other. It can open up new ways of valuing participation. It can bring us together. And most fundamentally, UBI structurally ends the extractivist nature of labour by disentangling paid labour from the capacity to survive. If you can leave a job which is unpleasant without the fear that you will be left behind, you're no longer a human resource. You're a human being and a valued member of our interdependent society. In this way, UBI is a fundamentally democratizing idea, shifting power, recasting the relationship between citizen and state. Instead of the state surveilling you and judging you, punishing you if you don't subscribe to its idea of valuable contribution, government becomes an enabler for every citizen to choose their own destiny. But importantly, it doesn't do that as atomized individuals. It does it through a universalist approach, applying the benefits to everyone and asking everyone to contribute to the extent of their abilities. Where surveillance-based welfare creates distrust, UBI assumes trust and by doing so cultivates trust. Where means-tested benefits tear us apart, setting up conflicts between deserving and undeserving, universalist policies bring us together and highlight a shared public good and interdependent diversity. Where job guarantee programs, as distinct from job creation programs, can continue to insist that we are only really valuable to the extent that we participate in the paid workforce, UBI values us for who we are, not what we do. As an enabler for citizens, it also enables a deeper and wider range of participation. One of the most punishing aspects of extractivist labour economics is that it deliberately keeps us so busy and distracted that we become politically submissive. UBI gives us time in our lives to make trouble, to make change, to change the world, or just to live how we choose to live, which of course is changing the world. As an artist too, I'm fascinated by the possibility of a UBI to enable artists to survive without the necessity of commodifying our art. Relying on ever meaner royalties has always been a nonsense, but it's also problematically anti-ecological. This idea that everything can and should be owned, applying not just to land, water, air, labour, but to ideas, to creativity, to art. I've always found that difficult to reconcile. Art has always borrowed and built on other people's ideas. Creativity isn't some individual pursuit. It only makes sense as part of the ecosystem of other art and ideas. And the same goes for most labour when you think about it. Finally, I also want to note that I believe that unionists can come to embrace UBI, despite the fact that many currently object to it as somehow, I've been told, giving up on work. Having been, as I see it, co-opted as part of this century-long shift from caring about the dignity of the working person to the dignity of work itself. There are, however, plenty of people who recall that unionism started as a fight to not allow work to become all-consuming and to take over the lives of working people, to not allow extractivism to turn us into resources. Unionism started with the fight to work less, the struggle for the 8-hour day and weekends and then paid sick leave and more. UBI really is simply the next logical step at this moment in history. And I'll leave it there so there's plenty of time for discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Very wonderful. Excellent. I'd love to keep commenting and draw questions, but we're going to save it till the end. So thank you, Tim. I'd now like to invite Jane Goodall to speak with us. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you. I hope very much that this will come across as a continuation, really, of what Tim is saying. A point I'd like to make at the outset is there's too little discussion of basic income. And when there is too little public discussion of a very big idea, and it's about as big as any political idea, what happens is that it gets subject to one-line responses, kind of one-dimensional. People say, oh, but everybody needs to work. And that's as much response as they need to give it. And I like to run the analogy. Suppose we lived in an economy that didn't have a developed tax system. Suppose it was an idea that people knew had been in the system somewhere back in the 18th century, but we didn't actually have a tax system. And gradually people started to propose that there should be one. And so somebody comes on the drum and it's mentioned in passing, the idea of a tax system, and then dismissed as, oh, but of course, how would you enforce it? People wouldn't want to work if they had to pay taxes. And the one-line response would be enough. It's as absurd as that. We need a massive, multi-dimensional discussion. We need specific implementation ideas and policy ideas. But just to move on through some of the terrain that Tim has staked out there, the commonest one-line response is, oh, but people wouldn't work, or it would stop people working when they really want to work. So in other words, somehow basic income is an alternative to work. That needs batting right out of court. I think we need some real clarity. One of the problems is conditionality. If a basic income is made conditional on work, which is the commonest view, all sorts of problems arise of the kind that we've seen happening, that Tim's been indicating, where you have an enforcement system, you have penalties, you have criteria, and you're back with the whole misery of a kind of misaligned power system controlling this. I think we need to start with the commons principle, which I like to track back to the 1640s. It goes further than that, but the Levellers of the 1640s, led by Gerard Winstanley, had some lovely, really lucid, succinct ways of putting it. Winstanley called the earth a golden treasury for all, and introduced the idea that everyone born of the earth has a right to subsistence from it. And in a nutshell, that would be my justification for basic income. It's a rights justification, first and foremost. Another thing Winstanley said was, he made a declaration that they were going on to St. George's Hill, this piece of commons land, as a community, to live together, to work together. So Tim's permeable walls, I think it's a big mistake to imagine basic income as something to do with an individual along the lines of the current support systems we offer the unemployed, where it's how can an individual possibly survive on X number of dollars. The point about basic income is everybody has it. It has an aggregate effect. It transforms social and community economics. So if you imagine everyone in your household has it, everyone in your neighborhood has it, everyone in your small village or town has it if you're in a regional area. Now that means that what an individual might need in terms of monetary or cash support is very different from what they might need in another kind of economy where no one has a basic income. You can survive on less. That means you can also work together. We then get to that point. Eleanor Ostrom talked of the commons as common pool resources. The commons always involved work. A commonwealth was a wealth of fish and water and land and forest, and you had to work to realize those resources and make them usable for human purposes. I like to think in terms of the 3 R's: rights, resources, and responsibilities. They all go together. So it's not someone imposing some top-down conditionality. The conditionality, or the conditions in which the commons are shared and resourced, need to be worked from the ground up. And that's where I think we do have to go back to the nitty-gritty of Elinor Ostrom's work. You have to figure out how to create those terms as society and as a community. Basic income and the commons should transform work. A transformative economy means a transformed economy of work. And if I have one question or one line I'd like people to take away from this, it's who owns the work? People don't ask that question. It's simply assumed that there are people called employers who hopefully will be in a position to employ people or willing to employ people. And the assumption underlying that is that somehow they're generating some profit and that will enable them to pay people. And then also they get the right to impose demands and requirements on the workforce. The truth that we're facing now, after a pandemic, and before that, the crisis of the bushfires, which has run into temporary amnesia, I think, is this paradox that we have less employment as a consequence of most crises, but we have more work. The Asian tsunami didn't create less work. It created masses more work, vast, unmanageable amounts of work, but it probably created a loss of employment. So those are not the same thing. And I'm going to make my presentation fairly brief, so I'm going to finish now. But with a return to the commons, in a true commons economy, your employer is the planet. The work arises from the natural world that affords us our fundamental resources. And our work is to maintain and cultivate and share those resources. By all means to develop them, but to develop them in such a way that they respect the limits and what the planet can afford. That is our true bottom line. And respect each other, because without a working community, you probably won't survive, as the early settlers in America found. So the planet is our ultimate employer, and we have an eye-watering deficit to the planet before any other kind of deficit needs to be considered. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. And Tim's put a comment there, which I love too, that the planet owns the work. The planet is the ultimate employer. And your incredible efficiency means you're 4 minutes earlier than your 12-minute deadline. So take note, other speakers, we have a little bit of extra room.
Well, I promised to give them to Loriana because she's got pictures.
Ah, she's got pictures. All right. Well, that's lovely. So I will now turn to Loriana. If you could share screen when you're ready, Loriana, and we'll hand over to you. Thank you. And thanks again, Jane.
There you go. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Michelle, and all other panelists and the audience. So I guess I will move from the more philosophical and fascinating into some more practical ways of looking at universal basic income. And in this presentation, I would like to offer an overview of the state of this debate between universal basic income and ecological health, and present options on how UBI could be designed to suit the needs of a post-productivist society. So I will therefore attempt to answer this question, which is often overlooked. How do we reconcile, in practical terms, UBI with an ecological paradigm? And before we do this, I would just like to quickly show what do we mean by UBI. So it's universal in the sense that all citizens and permanent residents of a country, and then of course there are different definitions, are entitled to it. It is unconditional. Basic, so the level that I assume here and in my own research, it's around the old age pension, and it is paid in income, so not in the form of goods and services. So it's not paternalistic. And what do we mean by post-productivism? So post-productivism refers to this necessity of taking into account ecological concerns when designing policies. And post-productivist ideals privilege disposable time over disposable income. In other words, it implies that the work, particularly paid work, is not or should not be a central pillar of society anymore, and that full employment is an unattainable or undesirable goal. A post-productivist social policy would try to value unpaid activities. So was well said by Tim. So also leisure time over formal employment, and would give citizens large and real opportunities to choose their life options outside the conventional labor market. A UBI would effectively acknowledge and compensate unpaid but socially valuable work such as civic engagement, care work, environmental stewardship, and artistic and creative behaviors. And it would give an egalitarian base that some authors suggest is essential to build a green economy. And post-productivism might also imply less consumption and therefore less ecological impact. So could universal basic income be considered a post-productive social policy? And would a universal basic income be a key part of a new ecological economy? So little research has been done on the environment and basic income intersect. Literature review published last year listed less than 1% of published academic papers on this relationship between basic income and ecological health, and how to create a UBI that is environmentally sustainable. And the fundamental question that still needs to be answered is, will a universal basic income result in more economic growth, employment, and consumption, or will it result in people engaging in less consumerist and materialistic activities? So far, we have had pilots and trials of various forms of basic income, but they're not expansive enough to incorporate environmental impact. And pilots tend to be very small and by design restricted only to some members of society. Some projects do contain measures that may provide indirect and incomplete data on potential environmental impacts, such as the Y Combinator project in California, the Ontario pilots. They contained a research on time use and volunteering, which may yield some understanding on the impacts of behavioral changes of a UBI. And other projects, such as those in Brazil and the Netherlands, do have conditional environmental components, but they cannot be considered a basic income because they have these very conditionalities. At the moment, one of the biggest trials to date that explicitly looked at general equilibrium effects of UBI on local economies is a quasi-UBI study done by the charity Give Directly. And so Give Directly gave about $1,000 to 10,500 households in rural Kenya. It was not a proper UBI because it was not universal, so there were conditions of eligibility to access this money, and it was not paid on an individual basis, but it was paid to household. However, researchers found that the cash transfer that benefit recipients, but also people in nearby villages, because recipients spend more money, and some of which went to the neighbors' businesses. But they also found fiscal multiplier 2.6 for this area, which implies that for every dollar that was given in basic income, there was a fiscal stimulus that grew the local economy by $2.6. And in addition, there was no significant inflationary effect. So while this study has been taken by some universal basic income advocates to prove that basic income does not disincentivize paid work and does not cause inflation, well, it's contradicting like what we're trying to achieve here. How do we reconcile it with a post-productivist objective, since in fact it increased productive work? So, slide, sorry. And so these are some of the reasons to be concerned that a UBI could negatively affect the ecosystem. And even if basic income was enacted by a direct redistribution from the wealthiest to the poorest, so with no net increase in total income per capita, we could still expect some negative environmental impacts due to increased consumption, due to differential in the marginal propensity to spend. And in addition, while UBI is simultaneously a collectivist idea, as Jane and Tim have highlighted, it is also one that privileges individual freedom of choice over paternalism of experts and governing bodies. And in certain situations, however, this focus on individual freedom may undermine collective elements of cultures and communities, threatening their ability to solve environmental and other problems. So we have to remind ourselves that the biggest issue here, the main issue, is to think of universal basic income as a standalone policy. UBI on its own is an incomplete solution to the multidimensional problems that face humanity. And no policy of this magnitude in history has ever or could ever been implemented out of a political vacuum, in the sense that public policies are designed and implemented as tools that engineer and steer behavior accordingly to the desired outcomes embedded in certain discourses, narratives, and overarching stories and visions of society. In other words, although a UBI has the potential to propel radically different behaviors, it cannot become a central pillar towards a green transition if this vision, if this story for the green transition is not articulated. So what are some of these potential? What potential does a UBI have to engender and propel radically different post-productivist behaviors? So there are a number, and I will focus here just on the post-productivist ones. So the recognition of autonomy and human value that Tim talked about before, beyond individuals' positioning in narrowly defined labor markets, and as this view of humans as primarily productive unit resources. This shift means that care and all kinds of informal contribution as creative endeavors will be recognized as intrinsically valuable and quintessentially human activities. And this might itself engender different kinds of behaviors based on trust. It promotes psychological security through stress and anxiety reduction. And this leads to a cascade of positive consequences at the individual and societal level. And it can also provide net fiscal savings through reduced government healthcare spending, a reduction in food bank, homelessness, shelters, and many other services. And this can provide funds to be reinvested in environmental protection, infrastructures, and more. It reduces status-based conspicuous consumption as the stigma attached to poverty is decreased, as well as the stigma attached to dependency. And this might promote the value of interdependency among humans and with nature. It shifts attention from material consumption to other opportunities like community-based provision, volunteer work, cultural and sports activities, and thus more sustainable, resource-efficient routes to well-being. It increases the ability of the poor to purchase higher quality, longer-lasting ethical goods, and this may have positive environmental effects. And even if the price was not a barrier to sustainable eating, for example, time constraints, habits, and knowledge can be. And UBI could provide time to commitment and information and knowledge acquisition. It can promote alternative production models like cooperatives through resource pooling. Its universal character means that it might strengthen solidarity, reignite the value and significance of the common good through socially beneficial behaviors such as care work, make and recycle cultures, or community and political involvement. UBI may provide the time and material resources needed for reconciliation and cultural healing with indigenous communities, leading to environmental regeneration as well. The Canadian North Shore Tribal Council has offered an Indigenous perspective on the relationship between UBI and community involvement. And it was suggested that more resources could reduce the economic compulsion to enter the formal westernized work and consumption-based economy, allowing for a return to our practices related to nature. And this relates to a wide variety of practices such as growing, harvesting, caretaking of the land, and assisting elders. And finally, McBay from the National Farmers Union of Ontario proposes that environmentally sustainable production could be directly stimulated by providing UBI for farmers facing increasing challenges, such as aging population, extreme weather condition, and corporate control of the food system. And an increase in supply of sustainably produced food may reduce prices of these goods to consumers, making environmentally sustainable food consumption more affordable. These may all not be automatic outcomes of a UBI, but are possible outcomes. And in the absence of certainty about such impacts, it is reasonable to ask what other programs would a green policy package include to steer UBI towards induced behavioral changes towards concepts such as care, equality, inclusion, trust, interdependence. There are two main ways in which such a policy package could be designed. Is through addition, and for the moment we have the example of Brazil, that since by 2014 actually, more than 70,000 households that were already receiving Bolsa Familia, which is a social security program, started to receive the Bolsa Verde addition if they lived in environmentally conservation areas. And in exchange for the funds, participants agreed to partake in environmental training activities, to engage in forest revitalization projects, and refrain from environmentally damaging activities such as clear cutting. And researchers found that recipients cleared less rainforest for agriculture, and that lost income from agricultural productivity was offset by payment. And the program was a catalyst for long-term pro-environment behavioral changes. Or we could add complements. And to date, Malville provided the widest range of complements. It makes a case for basic income, environmental protection, and social justice, simultaneously achieved by a program of interrelated and complementary policy objectives that are motivated around values of personal responsibility to others and other species. And they can be summarized as follows. So it's a universal basic income offering an adequate income floor for all, a restructure of the labor market to support green jobs and production and care work, local food security for good quality and affordable nutritious food, adequate environmentally responsible low footprint affordable housing, public transportation policies to support affordable and convenient public transit, habitat protection along with ecologically sensible and community-oriented land use planning, greener healthcare prevention, including health promotion strategies that promote a non-institutional and community-integrated care, ecological education that imparts the necessity of environmental citizenship with the practical skills and ethical values required for environmental sustainability, and zero population growth. So viewed in this way, a UBI will not so much be another ingredient of a green policy package as an instrument by which that package is constructed in the first place. And to close, I would just like to read this quote by Katie Weeks. We might demand a basic income, not so that we can have, do, or be what we already want, do, or are, but because it might allow us to consider and experiment with different kinds of lives, with wanting, doing, and being otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loriana. That was excellent. And within your time allotment, remarkable. You're all doing such a great job. Many questions, but again, we'll hold them off until the end. Our next speaker is James. James, are you there and can you hear us? Over to you, my dear.
Thank you. I'm just doing share screen now. Okay, so I want to focus on job guarantees, Green New Deals, and the reinvention of work. So I want to take a perspective informed by modern monetary theory, and I want to focus on the economic objectives and the mechanisms of relevance for each of these policy domains, and then discuss the reinvention of work against that backdrop. And I suppose the major aim is to clarify the rationale and the intended scope of each set of pertinent policy instruments in this light. Now, some of you might have seen Frank Stilwell this morning talking about the Green New Deal, which was a very informative talk. So that will be something I'll focus on. Just trying to find my cursor. Oh well, I'll try page down. Right. So the job guarantee, in a nutshell, the context for it is that the national government, that is the issuer of its own fiat currency, is the only agency that can create net financial assets through deficit spending. that cannot be created by state governments or local governments. The flow of net financial assets has to match the non-government sector's desire to net save. Otherwise, you have underemployment of labour and underutilisation of capacity. So what MMT highlights is that unemployment is a creation of government. And this is very evident to us as we've been living through the COVID era, where government, instead of turning on the tap, has turned off the tap, and unemployment is the result. Under a job guarantee, the jobs created are paid at the minimum wage and are designed not to directly compete with those of the domestic private sector. And that's so that the job guarantee functions as a buffer stock. As the private sector recovers, people can flow out of the job guarantee workforce back into the private sector. So what is the role of a job guarantee in that context? Its primary role is as an anti-inflationary instrument. The fact that unemployment is distributed highly unevenly, and the fact that it is very persistent, means that traditional policies of public investment and public employment will meet inflationary bottlenecks before full employment is reached. In other words, as you invest and as you create jobs in the public sector, those jobs, that investment may not be occurring where you find unemployment, particularly in remote regions. Now, that also means that the buffer stock under normal conditions won't be much larger than about 2% of the labour force. We're not talking about a large portion of people who are going to be employed under a job guarantee. And I think it's important to realise that fact. I find it very hard to move my cursor because of the speakers appearing. I think
Yeah, sometimes you can move the speaker box, James. You can actually...
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Good luck.
Okay, thank you. Now, all right. Now, in each of these policy areas, I've put in what I see as a particularly helpful reference. And in this case, there's a paper from the Levy Institute by Yeva Nersessian and Randall Ray on how to pay for the Green New Deal. And what the authors are proposing in this publication is a methodology that was developed by John Maynard Keynes in his How to Pay for the War pamphlet. But the ingredients that are included are those that require an estimate of the costs of the Green New Deal in terms of resource requirements, and a similar assessment of the resource availability that can be devoted to the implementation of Green New Deal projects. And that includes mobilization of both unutilised and underutilised resources, plus also shifting of resources from current destructive or inefficient uses to Green New Deal projects. And the main hurdle here will be that of inflation if sufficient resources cannot be diverted to the Green New Deal. So once again, we have an anti-inflationary mechanism in place, but it can be multitudinous. It can include well-targeted taxes, it can include wage and price controls, it can include rationing, and also voluntary saving. Now, during the Second World War, of course, voluntary saving was assisted both in Great Britain and in the United States through the issue of war bonds. And this was not just to all the wealthy, but to all classes in society to make resources more available. So from this sort of perspective, a Green New Deal is carefully framed within a sort of macroeconomic perspective. For those who might have seen the video produced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she takes us on a journey in a future time in America where the freeways and have to a certain extent been replaced by very fast rail and public transport systems connecting all the major cities. And it's quite an attractive sort of journey into the future. But anyway, some of the things that we've talked about so far in the conference, some of the things that Tim mentioned about stewardship rather than extractivism, of course, are features of this kind of Green New Deal. When we turn to the issue of reinventing work, obviously, one of the most fundamental issues is that capital really operates as a parasite. And the true source of value in an economy is the creative capacity of labour. By the same token, since the Neolithic Revolution, we've had labour being pulled out of production, both dead labour and living labour. Dead labour in the form of capital and also living labour directly applied. And those who are familiar with Göbekli Tepe, the archaeological site in Turkey, that dates back to about the 10th millennium BCE. And it was a site where the temple priesthood, if you like, cultivated grain that was used to make beer, which was then made available to the nomadic people who lived around the temple complex that long period of time ago. And of course, that cultivation of grain became the basis for a lot of the grain that was cultivated during the Neolithic Revolution throughout the Levant and into Egypt. So pulling labour out of production is really how to conceive of innovation in this whole process. Something, of course, that Marx emphasised was the threefold alienation of workers under capitalist modes of production. Workers are alienated from the production conditions, and that, of course, especially involves land. They're alienated from the production process and from products themselves. And of course, prices are regulated by abstract labour in the form of exchange value. And we have the commodification both of labour power and also of the natural conditions for production. Now, Randall Wray has done some interesting work examining the arguments of a couple of economists, Vatter and Walker. And the concern of Vatter and Walker, who've written a number of books on the issue over the years, is that investment as a component of aggregate demand contributes less to the growth in purchasing power, if you like, than it does to capacity. And the implication they draw from that simple fact is that the government share of the national economy must actually increase proportionately over time. So rather than seeing the government share in the economy decline, we would anticipate that it ought to be increasing proportionately by virtue of that fact. I guess my own view here is that a little bit more work needs to be done on the Vatter and Walker. Most of the statistical analysis is quite descriptive, and I'd like to certainly see some modelling work that establishes whether that is an inevitable result of capital development in current economic conditions. Anyway, in my own work on the reinvention of work, I focus on the digital economy. And anyone who's familiar with Robin Milner's notion of ubiquitous computer systems would know that he's talking about systems, artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotics that are sort of operating behind our backs. People talk about digital health nowadays. They talk about digital clothing. They talk about digital shopping where artificial intelligence can anticipate what kinds of things you're going to buy and pre-order so that stock is available. And I guess in all that sort of development, you've got to look at the darker side. And I've emphasized the fact that workers have to, in a nutshell, regain control over the machine. And technology isn't a pre-given, it's not determined, it's something which is subject to political struggle, and it requires a change in work organization. And one of the things I'm interested in is the widespread use of diagrammatic reasoning in machine learning and artificial intelligence, so that people who aren't necessarily programmers can actually influence what is going on in this vast machinery. And I've given a reference there to an interesting YouTube lecture on developments by Cat Lab, by a team at MIT specializing in scientific computing. And you can actually model very complex systems. They choose naturally in the current environment to model COVID epidemiology. So they have a very complex epidemiological model. But the point is that you not only have the model, you also have diagrams, and you don't need to program because you can manipulate the diagrams, and that does the programming for you. So there are ways in which people can actually regain control over technology, and that's something that I'm interested in. I'd just like to briefly sort of comment on UBI. I suppose historically, the concern I have is that if you look at Great Britain, for example, it was Keir Hardie, the founder of the British, one of the founders of the British Labour Party, who emphasised the right to work. And it was Churchill and Beveridge who gave workers welfare. And of course, in Indigenous communities, we call it sit-down money. So Conservatives have actually favoured welfare as opposed to the right to work. And I suppose a job guarantee is just one aspect. I've mentioned that it is not a significant component of the labour force in normal times. And of course, when we think of work, it's mainly public sector employment.
James, I'm very sorry to interrupt. You're a bit over time now, about a minute.
That's fine. I'll pull the plug right now. So that's all I really wanted to say. Public sector employment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. That was excellent. Thank you. I hated to interrupt you. I knew you were wrapping
That's
up.
all right.
Thank you. And if you're able to stop sharing screen, James, whenever you're ready, that would be great.
Yep. Done.
Now I'm really pleased to invite our last speaker, John August, to join us and share his perspectives on the world of work and UBI and other such things.
Okay, well, thank you. So I'm involved with the Pirate Party of Australia. I'm the treasurer, have stood for election. So what I'll be outlining is the Pirate Party approach to things, which is a style of UBI. It's not actually the UBI, I guess Laureana has described. And, you know, obviously we're not the only political party or activist group out there that's doing this sort of thing, and obviously invite you to have a look around at the options. But I guess what I'm outlining is a package, a proposal that we've put together with some nod to, I guess, political realities in terms of, you know, here's an actual thing that you take to the people when you're going to an election. So, as I say, our policy has a style of UBI, a negative income tax, which I suppose is not quite a universal basic income. It's better called a guaranteed basic income or a guaranteed minimum outcome. It's not that everybody gets the same parcel of money. If you make $40,000 a year, that means you don't pay any tax, nor do you receive government assistance. If you make more than this, you pay an incrementally flat rate of tax in the order of 37.5%. If you make less than this, and your income is top at zero income, you get the basic rate of income. So there's a few benefits. You reduce churn, where we pay tax which we later receive as benefits and refunds, with it being better to not have paid that tax in the first place. And we reduce the administrative costs associated with that. There's further savings because there's no longer the overhead of figuring out whether or not people should receive benefits. And there's an overall simplification to the tax system. Our tax system has more than 120 different taxes, and the welfare system encompasses more than 20 separate payments, each with different means tests, sub-payments, administrative arrangements, and compliance requirements. So we have made some adjustments. There's top-ups for veterans, disabled, and carers pensions, and there's also a top-up for rent assistance. Now, but it is an overall simplification with the associated benefits. So, you know, I guess our system has grown in a sort of an ad hoc sort of way, but we have at least come and said, here's the ideal UBI. What the adjustments do we need to make, and what reasons would we have for them? So we have tried to keep things simple, but, you know, a little bit of complexity, necessary complexity, not stuff that's just grown over time. So there's the benefit of removing poverty traps and providing an incentive for everyone to better themselves with no obstacles along the way. But having looked at our basic approach, I'll bring in some other more general issues. Now, these policies are always going to live in the shadow of affordability. You may need to maintain a balanced budget, at least to sell the package if nothing else. I realise there are other economic perspectives, but we're not trying to overload the electorate with too much. We've analysed Treasury figures and put together a package which may not give recipients a comfortable standard of living, but at least there's the benefit of reducing administration and the need to jump through hoops to receive the benefit, and you also get the benefit regardless. Now, there's concerns about what happens to other prices. Because we're redistributing income, our approach is not inflationary. We can worry about accommodation prices, but other parts of our policy endorse Georgia's land value taxation approaches, which does help to contain the price of accommodation. But a UBI does different things in different contexts, something that I think is important. And I think there are some different views of like, is there employment available, or have we moved to a post-job economy? And there's different timeframes there. But when there is some employment available, you want to give people a safety net, but also an incentive to employ themselves. Now, there's an underlying issue of just how many jobs and possibilities are out there, be they potentially provided by the government or private industry. Now, our approach tries to encourage individual enterprise, cottage industry, if you will, rather than relying on government or business to provide work. They would have their place, of course, but not something to rely on. Now, but there really are only a minuscule number of jobs available in the outside economy. Then the UBI should be enough to live comfortably without any need for additional money. And as I've noted, people contemplate a time in the future when automation means that there aren't jobs in the way that we understand it now. But regardless, we should still be encouraged to participate in society productively through volunteer efforts outside of financial participation. We would also seek to support people who cannot find volunteer avenues by their own initiative through a volunteer bureau. Now, the point is that in this context, voluntary efforts would be just that, voluntary, without any financial compulsion or remuneration. Now, the bureau is only there for people who might need some assistance in finding an outlet. If people know enough to talk to people and make their own arrangements, that is all well and good. And if people can make their own arrangements, that's a good thing. I consider that to be a dynamic, effervescent, emergent world, you know, with percolating up from the ground up, which I think is actually a good thing. Now, there's also the possibility that people aren't trained for what jobs do exist if we're assuming there are some jobs out there. Now, our policy includes a strong commitment to education, and as part of the overall package of volunteer bureau and education training, support can be given to people going into business themselves. There's also the possibility of setting up training work centres for people to get experience, to bridge the gap between the skills of the job seeker and those sought by the employers. This would help people break through the you need a job to get experience, but can't get experience without a job nexus, if that is actually a blockage at that point. So the Pirate Party also has a commitment to supporting mental health. For those who can't find work in the regular market or the Volunteers Bureau because of mental health issues, there can be additional support for people to have work under the mental health umbrella. It's worth recognising that in time there was a thing called workers' therapy at some mental health facilities. Our emphasis is having an outlet or a calling, but not necessarily something in a work context. But we do recognise the worth of giving people an outlet as appropriate. In any case, further down the track, when regulations around occupational health and safety and workplace health and safety started to bite, it became impossible to run such projects. There was never any willingness to pursue these initiatives within the facilities themselves. It was unfortunately the indifferent bureaucratic and regulatory march that did them in. Our party recognises the unfortunate effects of petty bureaucracy throughout our society, not just here but all over, and we'd want to remove this obstacle to allow such things to prosper again. It's been claimed that UBI-style approaches do not mean that there is any push for employers to raise wages. In fact, employers must provide a sufficient wage for it to be worth people working. Under the current rather wasteful scheme, people tried to make a show of looking for work on the understanding the support is temporary. But under our negative income tax, or UBI of sorts, people can continue indefinitely, and employers must offer sufficient for people to want to take up the job they're offering. This means an upwards pressure on wages. It's sometimes claimed that UBIs would be inflationary. Now, in some cases that might be true if you're introducing more money into the system to chase the same number of goods and services. But our approach is revenue neutral. We're realigning the tax system, realigning the way we route money without the need to actually print any more of it. It's important to remember that there may not be jobs available to provide employment. It's clear hypocrisy on the part of the current government. If the number of job seekers suddenly increases, they claim it is laziness on the part of the citizens rather than a shift in the economy. You have a needless rhetoric of blame that is politically convenient, shoring up the privileged and placing an undue burden on the less well-off. In fact, there's currently a tension between the level of inflation and employment, with some claims that we're currently setting up that we currently have a pool of unemployed to keep inflation down. That's the so-called NIRU, or non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Now, to the degree this is an issue, we're talking about providing added support for the unemployed and more freedom and options than they currently have, meaning this concern is no longer an issue because the unemployed would no longer be such a cost on the individual, the economy, or society. You could characterise the identification of this trade-off as noting the existence of the NIRO and the need for a pool of unemployed. Or you could say that a pool of unemployed is a necessary cost in order that inflation be controlled and the possibility of a much larger level of unemployment be avoided in the longer terms. On balance, however, the rhetoric at play in the overall perspective suggests that this policy approach panders to the better off at the expense of those who have been shortchanged by the economy. But needless to say, all these concerns are made irrelevant by the UBI. Further, if there are changes to the level of employment resulting from the changes in the economy, we no longer have a government blaming the unemployed for their own situation. Now, there is obviously the job guarantee, which is into the mix, and I would note that the Australian Workers' Party does actually embrace modern monetary theory and a job guarantee approach. Now, I actually favour the UBI approach, but certainly within the Pirate Party, we have had discussions and actual public debates on the merits of job guarantee, which is something that you can look up if you're interested. I invite you to perhaps look at our website, and there is an article that I wrote for the NENA Journal some time ago, which does outline these things in more detail. So anyway, that's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good timing for all. Sorry, John, can you perhaps put, there's a bit of echo. Thank you. We might now go to Q&A, and I was just about to say what's great is because everyone's kept on time. We've got 25 minutes for questions. To start with, I've collected 3 questions from the chat section already. The first one is from Peter, directed, I think, to Loriana, but if anyone else would like to answer, of course. The question is, regarding limitations to UBI, you've touched on possible benefits to cooperative environmental activities. So could such outcomes be included and reinforced and even rewarded?
Yes, well, absolutely. And this is why, I hope this is the message that came across, that universal basic income needs to be embedded within a broader vision. And this point of this cooperative behavior, it's of course can be one of the outcomes, because once people are given back the freedom of time, which is so important, we don't talk enough about the politics of time. How do we use our time, which is such a precious resource? These might lead to other behaviors which are more pro-social, and that's the reason why I listed them. But yeah, what I was investigating, and what I wanted to prompt is it might be, but it might not be. And it can be if it is included within, where are we going as a society? Are we making ecological and social well-being and equality a core tenet? So this is, hopefully it answers it.
Did anyone else have any other comments on that? Jane or anyone? No?
Well, I'll actually toss in something. not so much environmental, but there is the possibility that people who are receiving UBI might pool their resources and do something together. I mean, UBI is obviously enabling the individual, that's a good thing, but it's not prohibiting the possibility of collaboration. And, you know, we can imagine people giving, I guess, what you might call venture capital or Arab-style loans, because I wouldn't be comfortable with anyone receiving a government payment, putting them into future debt. But basically, whatever enterprise they get into, if there's profits, that entity might get a share of the profits, but if it fails, the people involved aren't susceptible to any further liability. But there are options for collaboration, and UBI doesn't just have to be an individual thing.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
sorry, Michelle, if I just may add, because there was the very interesting plenary yesterday on commoning and the sharing economy, and this is what John is referring to. So through a UBI, all these new ideas of how to redesign and how we do we cooperate, how do we common resources, like everyone would have this basic floor, so the pooling of resources into the sharing economy, the commoning, and so on. So it's an enabler, you know, it's a means towards an end.
Also just wanted to add as well, I thought just in relation to Jane's brilliant metaphor about the tax system, that if you were trying to introduce it today, people would say, oh, well, you can't do that because of X or Y. We also don't expect the tax system to solve every problem. And it's really interesting how you often get this idea with UBI that it's got to be a silver bullet. And if it can't solve all of the problems itself, then it's not good enough. UBI, I think what really came through all of these presentations today is that we all see, whether it's UBI or job guarantee or Green New Deal, all of these approaches are actually enmeshed together, all sorts of different ways of doing things. And it's actually that diversity of approach, which is its strength, in fact. So yeah, it's not going to solve all of the problems on its own, but it's a really great, I think in many ways, a critical part of the path to solving most of it.
If I can throw in, there is perhaps even a logical fallacy, the nirvana fallacy, that something must be perfect, and if it's not perfect, then it's worthless. And obviously articulated that way, obvious that it's a stupid thing to say, but a lot of political debate is of that variety. You know, this thing isn't perfect, so we just dismiss it and move.
Just to follow up on that,
Yeah.
I think it's actually perhaps counterintuitively one of the great strengths of a basic income movement, that it involves huge amounts of problem solving, of really concerted thinking about fundamental matters. I get very tired of dealing with it at the level of an assumption that it's the dole for everyone and it's some alternative to work. That is absolutely not what the fundamentals of basic income are. It is contrary to that view. And it's not even as, you know, it enables community. It makes that absolutely essential, the communal development of work systems. But I think whichever side of the fence you're thinking, the kind of job guarantee, modern monetary theory side or the basic income side, I don't really think we need to be in opposed camps, but we have to rethink the organisation and management of work in the economy. And my main problem with the job guarantee argument is it leaves governments at whatever level, and that's to be determined, in charge of deciding what the work is and who's going to do it. So hypothetically, say you get a situation in one of the bushfire affected towns, you know, from January, where a lot of houses have gone, a lot of businesses have gone, a lot of animals and livestock have been killed. And a government refuses to allocate the workforce to rebuild that. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to prevent that? Suppose you get rogue governments, and you can get them at state level, in councils, in federal government, who decide, okay, we've decided we're going to allocate this whole area of workforce, you know, X% of the workforce to this purpose. And it would be something entirely of their own ideological determination. It might be in defiance of quite urgent needs elsewhere. I mean, I think these are massive problems. We need to allocate large amounts of human work to recycling. You know, we have continents of rotting plastic in the ocean. Well, what government is going to be allocating work resources to that if you leave it in charge of governments? How are you going to enforce the allocation of work where it's most needed?
Thank you for that question, Jane. And I was actually going to turn to the question you typed in there, which I'm now going to read, and I might invite
All right, that's it.
James and others to respond. No, but just to reiterate the question, job guarantee means that the work will be identified, organised and distributed by governments. And then that comes back to your questions. How does that happen? How does it work? And how could we manage any kind of difficulty? And I'm wondering, James, if you wanted to respond, anyone else in the panel wanted to respond. And in fact, I have a private question that says, could somebody please reiterate the difference between UBI and job guarantee? So if somewhere in your answer, people can kind of do these are the differences, the similarities, that might be helpful. James, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I suppose, I mean, UBI was well described by Loriana. It's universal, it's basic, it's income, whereas the job guarantee is employing people at the minimum wage to do things of value to the community. And it's designed to employ people who wouldn't be employed through expansion of the public sector. And I'd just like to come back to this issue because I think it's vital to realize that if you have unemployment, it's because the government is not deficit spending enough. And the other side of the coin to that is it's creating net financial assets. If it's not creating enough financial assets to meet the desire of the non-government sector to net save, you will get unemployment. So unemployment is the creation of government. And the question is, well, how do you get government to wake up to that fact and do something about it? For many, many decades, Menzies tried to eliminate full employment in Australia, but he couldn't because there was so much community support for it. What eventually killed full employment, and that was the Bill Hayden budget of 1975, was the first episode of stagflation. So it took a lot, an enormous force to sort of wipe full employment out of the equation. So I suppose, I mean, you mentioned this morning the strategy for civil society, and I think it's crucial to try and regain control over government's behaviour because they have become increasingly punitive, as Tim Hollow pointed out. They have become bloody-minded over this whole issue of full employment. And as a society, we need to regain control over government. The absence of full employment has also probably contributed as much to the weakening of the labour movement as the hostile legislation that has undermined union rights in this country. And I think that's enough out of me for the moment.
Tim, yep.
I'd be really interested, James, in your thoughts on this idea that often goes through my head on the job guarantee question, and maybe I think it takes Jane's question a little bit further in terms of the kinds of, you know, who makes the decision and what kind of decisions are made. In terms of your excellent explanation of NAIRU and that kind of process, doesn't it make more sense, particularly when you're thinking about the kinds of people who are unemployed at the moment, you know, in my circles, even, you know, tertiary educated folks, a whole lot of university employees, academics, younger academics, even middle-level academics becoming unemployed. A lot of people, you know, in their middle age, people for whom, you know, minimum wage work is frankly not really suitable, actually. And it's quite, it'll be quite alienating work for them, the kind of work that they would get at a minimum wage, which is not the kind of path that we want to go down. In terms of a NAIRU sort of approach, wouldn't it be better for government to use effectively industrial policy rather than a job guarantee? Wouldn't it be better for government to say, we're going to put a lot more money back into the university sector, we're going to invest through a Green New Deal a massive amount in renewables infrastructure, in public housing, and all of these kinds of things, which are job creation programs which are pushing towards full employment? Doesn't that make more sense?
it makes an enormous amount of sense. And I would say yes, 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 yes. We don't want the job guarantee to become an enormous expansion of aggregate demand policy. The role of public investment, the role of public training, the role of job expansion within the public sector is fundamental. The job guarantee is just there to mop up the highly persistent and highly dispersed unemployment in much the same way that the Community Employment Development Program actually funded a lot of really important community projects in Indigenous communities when Labor governments were Labor governments.
Mm.
So we need to regain that momentum, that initiative.
Cool.
Thanks, guys and girls. Were there any other responses? I mean, obviously we're going to come around these issues. I've got a question from John Shield, just saying, how does a UBI impact the workforce for essential services such as education and healthcare? Anyone like to jump off and answer that?
I'll have a go.
Oh, good, thank you. You go first, Jane, and then I think Tim.
One of the hesitations maybe is that there's a little bit of a presumption underlying the question that, again, UBI would draw people out of the workforce and they would feel they didn't have to work. And that's very much not how most UBI advocates would see it at all. Those essential services are often a curious mix of formal employment and informal voluntary work, or huge amounts of unpaid and unacknowledged overtime, because they are forms of public service. I'm sure many of us who've worked in health or education have done uncountable overtime hours because we know we're working for the common good. So UBI, if you like, is a way of kind of putting a floor under the whole income, the whole economy, so that people have more flexibility in the way they work. So you might increase the voluntary element. I mean, that doesn't mean you want to make essential services voluntary, but you might increase a voluntary element. And I think there the bushfire, the volunteer bushfire service is a brilliant example. I mean, that is just consummately well organised coalition of employed, formally designated positions and organised volunteers to do an essential service. So I think you could get a better quality fusion of formal employment and volunteer work, including that of very experienced volunteers who might have retired from formal employment. But hopefully more of the kind of resources of the nation, if you like, would move in the direction of socially valuable work.
Yes, and if I might jump and add on that. Yeah, the question mentioned these two sectors, you know, and they are built on public ethos. And I think the strength of UBI, particularly within the public sector, is that while, you know, universal basic income acknowledges that it's through work that we do for others that we get a recognition and self-esteem. And so the difference here is that work is not meant in a narrow conception of profit-generating activity. And it's with this recognition that a UBI gives that it, in fact, can foster this ethos of contribution towards the public good as a counter gift. So yeah, it might actually, in fact, enhance the public sector. Like more people might be drawn to the public sector instead of the other way around.
Talking to myself again. Sorry, thank you, Loriana. Tim, did you have comments you were going to share?
Loriana and Jane basically covered what I was going to say very effectively.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question here, and I hope I can word it the right way.
Michelle, can I make a bit of a comment there on the last one?
Sure.
There's a very general part of the prevailing economic narrative that nurses are not paid what they're worth, and yet, you know, merchant bankers get paid a bucket load. And that's, I guess, a prevailing inequity of the current situation. And, you know, put aside universal basic income, if we actually solve that problem, that would, shall we say, underlying inequity. And I'm not sure just how much UBI has to do with it, but obviously I endorse the other comments that have been made so far.
Thank you, John. Good points. Matt has asked, I think, an interesting question. Do we need some social recognition of our voluntary activities and pastimes? That is, do we need a UBI to recognise individual contributions, even though that might not consist of payment? And I'm wondering if Matt is also kind of gently touching on the time bank ideas, but I'd love any immediate responses from you guys, if possible.
I'd love to respond to that.
Yeah,
I think really fascinating point. And to me, what it goes to, and I'm not sure if this is where you were going with it, Matt, I think it is Loriana mentioned Kathy Weeks. There's a and Elise Klein is another, you know, great Australian academic who's put a lot of effort into the idea of UBI, effectively kind of broadly valuing reproductive labour, the kinds of labour that we do that are not part of the production consumption economy. It's the care stuff. It's the contribution. It's the participation. It's the kind of thing where we do them because we feel we want to do them and it's the right thing to do, and we do it because of care and love, not because we want to get paid. And in fact, in some ways, payment for it devalues the contribution. And we see this, you know, the point that John was just making about the idea that nurses are underpaid, for instance. When we pay for reproductive labor within the capitalist framework, we undervalue it massively. And so what I think UBI does in a really interesting way is it doesn't pay for that reproductive labor, but it creates the space for people to engage in the reproductive labor by enabling people to survive, essentially. So I think, is that an answer to your question, Matt? I think that's one of the really most fascinating parts of it for me is giving people the space in their lives to engage in that kind of reproductive labor, and in addition, productive labor if they choose to do so on top of that, without actually paying for it.
Yeah. Well, I think we do a lot.
Were there any other comments from the panel?
Sorry.
Can I just respond to a comment that's come up on the thread from Live Well Tasmania?
Yep.
There's some great thinking coming from that group. We had a little bit of dialogue with them, with a team I've been working on a livable income policy, which is a little bit of fusion of UBI and job guarantee ideas. But that really starts to address the question of who owns the work. I keep going back to this. So if it's close to a ground up, like council levels, communities, I think that's a very sound, genuinely commons kind of thinking. And it allows responses to local need, which are critical, especially in a very stressed economic environment. I think the local is critical. You're still left with the question that nowhere's easier to corrupt than a local council. But like I say, none of these is going to have magic solutions. We've got to really deal with good quality policies for social management, and ethics for councils have become even more important under something like this.
Michelle, if I can say something about recognition. Now, my understanding is in ancient Rome, people would build public buildings just for the sakes of being recognised. And I mean, it's a social thing, something you would hope would emerge over time, but basically people could look with pride at the things that they've done, and that would generally be socially recognised. But I would say I'd hope that would happen, but I don't want to have any actual system of awards and merits or anything like that. But just, you know, we would hope for other social developments and part of this whole emergent thing as society changes.
Can I respond?
We've got a bit of crossing over there. Yeah, so James, did you want to go back to that question, or responding to Jane's comment to Live Well?
Yes, I wanted to respond to the Live Well Tasmania comment there. I mean, a similar proposal has come from the ACT as well. And young labour in a number of states have embraced this kind of job guarantee. One of the reports that the Centre for Full Employment and Equity at Newcastle published was for Jobs Australia, and it was just this very issue of how to involve local councils and local NGOs in the implementation of a job guarantee, taking on board that notion that local agencies are better able to respond to local need. And so I don't see this as incompatible. It's sort of fundamental to the implementation of job guarantee. But of course, once again, we have to highlight the fact that local governments aren't in the capacity to fund, to fill the gap, I guess, achieving full employment on their own. The funding has to come from the national government that has the monetary sovereignty and issues the fiat currency.
Sorry. Yes, and thank you very much, James. Were there any other comments from the rest of the panel? Given the time, we may have some time for a very quick question, but I'm loath to go over time because it's been a very long day and everyone's been glued to Zoom, and I'd love to release you into the wild so we can all stretch our legs. That said, there's one last quick question from someone called Michelle. It's not me. So I'll just throw it quickly. The Labor versus capital or us and them ethos is not inevitable. There could be a role for workplace democracy. Also, there could be a role for consumers in supporting such workplaces. Do the panelists have any comments? Nodding sagely.
Yes.
Thoughts?
Well, I remember when I worked in the bowels of the United Trades and Labour Council in South Australia, and we had a full-time person involved in the right to, well, workplace democracy. And it was very much a trade union consideration. But at the moment, the trade unions are so sort of flat-strapped, trying to cope with their day-to-day operations. They don't really have the resources or time to devote to this kind of issue. But I think it's fundamental. And consumers, of course, are getting involved more and more in a variety of public policy decision-making processes. And a lot of agencies now use multi-criterion analysis and focus groups to try and get consumer input into public policy. And I think that's a vital aspect of it as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, I think it's absolutely central, and I think they're interesting parallels, as I was saying, kind of UBI being a democratizing idea in my conception of it, enabling democratization of the workforce as well is a central part of the picture of what we're trying to do, and linking that again with the point made in the comments thread about deliberative democracy in terms of, you know, Jane's important point about the corruptibility of local council in the current system, you know, creating deliberative democratic spaces at that local council level, but doing that in our workplaces as well. And it's all about really bringing agency back for people, rather than this very, very top-down statist approach and corporatist approach where we've got these behemoths, these leviathans, which control everything. It's flipping that and bringing agency back into our lives.
That's excellent, Tim. Thank you. And I think that might be a good point to wrap up on. And I do like, I know that this has already been commented on, but there's a little comment here by Lavina. I'd like to end on this sentence. A basic income of some sort would give people the freedom to choose to follow their passions, which will contribute to a better society. And me personally, that's why I've always been excited about the notion of having even a small bit of money without guilt, without being called a lazy bugger, to go and be creative and to do great things for society. And let's face it, groups like NENA have been driven 100% volunteer time. Most of you, I'm sure, are involved in huge amounts of volunteering. And imagine what the world could look like if everyone was allowed to do the volunteer work they wanted to do and actually got paid for it. I think the whole system would turn on a really quickly on its head. So, but look, thank you so much, everyone. I've really enjoyed this session. I hope you have two incredible speakers with such great wisdom. And I hope that everyone can join us for the evening session which I think there's a break and then there's a start, and then we have more fabulous NENA conference tomorrow. So huge thank you to all of you. Big daggy air clap from me. Hurrah! And yeah, thank you so much. Gosh, I love NENA. Oh, you're all so good. I will talk to you tomorrow, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.